All we need is a place to be and a few good friends for some company. If you'd like to stay, you don't have to leave. We'll leave the lights on and the door unlocked. If you drop on by, you don't have to knock. We're happy to share whatever we've got.
Hi, I'm Clay, and this is Yarn About You, a podcast where I get to chat with people I know and love, as well as people I'd just like to meet and hear their story. Yarn About You would like to pay respect to the traditional owners of the land in which this podcast is recorded, the Darkinjung people, and acknowledge the elders, past, present and emerging, for their contribution and wealth of knowledge that they pass on from generation to generation. Today's guest is Mr. James Charles. He's an actor and writer who's had an interesting creative life here in Australia and all around the world. James is an absolute gentleman with a voice I could listen to all day. I'm also lucky enough to call him my friend. I hope you enjoy our yarn. James, welcome to Yarn About You.
Thank you.
It's always wonderful to speak to you, you know that.
I say it's always about me anyway, so that's fine.
That's right. I seem to have a lot of friends that are like that for some reason. But I want to go deep. I want to go right back with this conversation. I want to learn about you, and I want to learn about where you came from. So let's start with your parents. Tell me the story about your parents.
Okay. My father was a 50-year-old Scot when he married my mother, who was a 19-year-old Irish lady.
Okay.
They met during the war, or just after the Second World War, this is, somewhere in London or thereabouts. And they fairly quickly had a family of 6 children, of which I am the second. I've always thought of myself as an Englishman in a way, but Ancestry.com and their DNA tests prove that, in fact, I'm not English at all. I may sound like an Englishman. That's the result of grammar school and drama school in London, I think. But I'm 97% Irish and 3% Iberian, i.e. Spanish, whatever.
Okay.
Because my mother was first generation Irish. My father, though he was a Scot, his grandfather was an emigrant from Ireland to Scotland. So all of my DNA really goes back to Ireland, which suits me fine because it suits my temperament.
Irish people cranky?
Yeah, thank you. I was thinking more in terms of sort of prone to romanticism, and in my drinking days, prone to being maudlin and romantic in that sort of rather Irish way.
Aha. So growing up in London, whereabouts in London did you grow up?
I grew up in South London. Again, talking about my voice, if you listen to my 3 brothers, they're not exactly Cockneys or anything, because South London isn't that, but they are much more London accent-wise than I am. Croydon in those days was a suburb of London. It's now really a part of Greater London. But we grew up there. My father was a school caretaker at that point, so we lived sort of within the grounds of a Catholic senior school, and junior school, which is where we all went to school. And then obviously I went to a different school when I was 11 years old, and then I went to a posh Catholic grammar school.
It always fascinates me about England, how the different types of accents. We were listening to, Amanda and I were watching a show last night with a strong Liverpool accent. You could hardly understand them. Yeah. But you know, in England, you can go 2 hours either direction and get a completely different sound. It always fascinates me, and I always wonder how, now that the world's getting a lot smaller with television and communication, whether that is slowly dying out.
Yeah, I'm not sure it is really in England. I mean, I don't go back that often since I've been in Australia, but I was talking, funny enough, to a lady here the other day about another project that I'm doing, and she was recognisably from the Newcastle region. Very, very different accent than Liverpool, or I've got friends that live near Manchester, very different accent again. People from the southwest, very different accent, and it is quite surprising that, given it's such a small island, that there are still enormous differences. And you know, you could count Scotland. I mean, it's only 400 miles from London to Edinburgh, 700 kilometers or whatever that is. And yet you could hardly have a different voice than an English one and a Scottish one.
That's right.
So,
In Wales, I mean, that's less than driving from here to Brisbane, from Sydney
yeah,
to Brisbane.
oh,
So,
God, absolutely, yeah. Wales is, you get to Wales from London in 2 hours, and then they all speak in a very different way. Look, you.
so speaking of travel,
Yes.
it was a major event for us to move out of Sydney an hour up the road. How did you end up deciding that, okay, I'm going to move from London, where my life was, to Australia on the other side of the world? How did that happen?
Well, I first came to Australia. I'm not sure whether it was before you were born, but pretty much so, I think, in 1985. So how many years ago is that?
I was born in 1973, James, but thank you very much.
There you go. So you were 12, and I was whatever age I was in 1985, and I came to Australia from London with a play. We had done 3 months in the West End in London, and it was a very popular play. It ran in the end for about 13 years in London. Um, but it used to change casts every 3 months because it was very popular, and all the soap opera stars and all the sort of names of English television and theatre wanted to be in it.
Was that
Um,
Run for Your Wife?
Correct. Run for Your Wife was
Excellent.
its name. Uh, a really strange farce written by a lovely man called Ray Cooney, which was about a bigamous taxi driver. And I need go no further into that really. But yeah, it was a farce with, different misunderstandings and different, well, he had two different households. He had a wife and a household one side of the town and the same the other side. But of course, the shit hit the fan eventually and it all went berserk. But anyway, I happened to be in the cast with a very small part and understudying the lead actor in the play. And we were asked if we wanted to go to Australia with this production, but everybody had to say yes. They weren't going to do any recasting, and it was sort of this cast or nothing. As it happened, everybody was quite keen. So that was it. January, I think, 1985, we flew out of London where it was about -2 degrees, and we flew into Perth where it was about 45, I think. So it was a
Absolutely.
shock to the system. And we did 6 weeks in the Regent Theatre in Subiaco in Perth,
Hmm.
the one and only theatre in the world where I've ever had my name on the board outside,
Oh, wow.
because there was such a long facade. It was a sort of converted cinema that they put everybody's name on the board, including me and the young lady who was understudying the female roles in the thing. So there we are. So 6 weeks in Perth, and then we came and did 6 weeks in Sydney. But um, I started a love affair almost immediately in Perth with a young artist who was 10 years younger than me, and he was the barbecue chef on Saturdays in the hotel complex that we stayed in. We actually had little apartments in this complex. We had one each, and he and I fell in love. I mean, ridiculously. Almost immediately, and that had never happened to me before, although I'd had a couple of relationships before.
Hmm.
And that's a long story that stretches for the sort of 13 years ahead. But for the moment, let's just say that I had to go to Sydney in 6 weeks, and I said to him, "Why don't you come with me?" And he said, "Well, I'll lose my job." And I said, "Well, that's not your job. You're an artist," which is what he is. I said, "You can get any job doing barbecues, but whatever." Anyway, so he did come to Sydney with me and lost his job. And that was the beginning, as I say, of a long-term relationship, sometimes long distance. Sometimes he came to London, sometimes I came here. Um, so I fell in love with him, but I also fell in love with the country. He was born in the bushland outside Sydney, outside Perth rather, and showed me, some lovely spots, along the coast of Western Australia, down places like Albany and the
Beautiful over there.
Karri forests and caves and things, and I'd never seen anything like it in my life. So it was a double whammy. And if I could have done after the 6 months in Sydney was up, I would have stayed. And well, I did stay, but I couldn't stay long term because I was on a working visa that was extended a little bit past. Stephen went back to Perth, but I had a friend who happened to be here at the time, who I'd been at drama school with, and she and I went on a sort of 2-month tour of the country, which really cemented my love of this extraordinary open ancient landscape. I think I did, I can't quite remember, but I think I did 20, or we did 28,000 kilometers in just a few weeks, maybe a month or something.
Wow.
This was all on Greyhound buses. We went from Sydney to Adelaide, and then from Adelaide right up through the centre, stopping at what was then called Ayers Rock. And to my shame, we climbed that rock. I would not do that these days. And of course, I call it, as one should, Uluru. But up through there, up to Alice, and then further north up to Darwin, and then across from Darwin through Mount Isa to northern Queensland to Townsville, and then back down that coast to Sydney. So sort of half the country. So the only part of the country I've never been to is the northern part, really, of Western Australia.
So you were zigzagging backwards and forwards from London to Australia in that time. I just want to ask you before we get to Australia, you did a couple of quite well-known to Australian television shows over in London. One of them being, you did an episode of Hello, Hello, which I love. And it kind of makes me sad when you watch shows like Hello, Hello or Benny Hill or the Paul Hogan show here, that you couldn't do those shows these days. But the humour and the way that it's put together is to highlight that, you know, a lot of the racism and a lot of the stuff is wrong. But unfortunately, I don't know, we don't seem to get irony, we don't seem to get the comedy anymore. But those sorts of shows are the shows that shaped me and I grew up with. So I'm really interested to hear your experience on particularly Hello, Hello. And you also did some work on Ripping Yarns, directed by one of my heroes, Michael Palin from Monty Python. Can you let me know the experience working on those shows?
Sure. Hello, Hello was an interesting one because, I played a German corporal who was tasked with a little team of other soldiers to move some barrels from Rene's cellar to somewhere else because we were confiscating them. They were supposed to be barrels of wine. The joke, which of course the audience knew, was that the escaped British airmen were inside these barrels.
Okay.
So we were actually moving them to safety by taking them out of the thing, and they eventually escaped. So that was the sort of subplot that was going on. But I enjoyed doing it, but I pushed up a bit against the director because I wasn't doing it. My cod German wasn't silly enough. And I was finding it quite hard. I can't remember many of the lines now, but I had to say at one point, those are the barrels over there. That was my opening line. And I was saying something like, those are the barrels over there. And he's saying, yes, it's a bit French. He said, can you make it more German? And I was trying really hard, but we had to do 2 or 3 takes. And I don't think at the end of the day that he was still very happy with it. I wasn't being quite sort of Hitler enough, really. And I found that quite difficult. But, it was an interesting experience. And it was, as you say, hugely popular. I mean, they had a permanent set in one of the film studios north of London. It might have been Elstree or somewhere, but the village square where the cafe and everything was a permanent set, like a sort of film set, because they did, they were filming different things, different stories every week.
Wow.
Ripping Yarns was a much more interesting thing. Michael Palin wrote the stuff, 6 episodes, all different boys' own kind of stories. He wrote them. He didn't direct them, though he liaised a lot with the actual director. They chatted a lot during the stuff. But of course, he also starred in all of them. So the one that I was in, strangely enough, also had German connections because it was called Escape from Stalag Luft 112B. And it was a First World War drama set in a prisoner of war camp where the prisoners of war were us, the British. I was a British airman. I think we were all British airmen that had been captured, during the war. And we were in the camp. But the story, the conceit of the story was that Michael Palin's character was a sort of obsessive compulsive escapee. He was forever trying to get out, digging tunnels, making, false bottoms in things and constantly getting caught and beaten up. And he couldn't quite understand why we, the rest of the British, were sort of, quite chilled to stay, in the prisoner of war camp where, we were allowed to do our own thing. The Germans looking after us were very deferential because I think their main officer was a sergeant or something, whereas we had a colonel or somebody in our group. So he was always being very deferential and being told, you can't come in here. This is the British quarters. It was all very sort of, it was anti-German, even though we were the prisoners. And at one point, there was a wonderful actor called, oh gosh, no, can't remember. But the guy who played the lead thing had some lovely lines like, don't, in a sort of cod German accent again, funny enough, don't speak to me like that. You are the prisoners, after all, we won, He used to get very cross because we were very superior to him. Anyway, I mean, there was a wonderful bit, for instance, we were playing cricket and somebody hits the ball over the fence into the field beyond. And, oh, that's the only ball we got, somebody get it. So I say, Captain Walker, I said, I'll get it. So I climbed over the fence. I actually did this, no stunt people. I actually climbed over this sort of fence and vaulted over it and ran across the field and threw the ball back and then came back over the fence. And Michael Palin's character sort of stood there in stunned silence. The fact that I had been outside the camp and he couldn't understand why I had kept running and escaped. And at the end of the story is that everybody leaves. He's been locked up for the nth time in a sort of solitary cabin, and then he wakes up the next morning to find that not only have all the British gone, but all the Germans have gone too. There's nobody there at all apart from him. So, and that was the sort of punchline, if you like, him standing there looking bewildered and finding that he's actually the only one in the camp and everybody else has gone. But that was great fun filming it. We actually filmed it in a disused barracks in Salisbury Plain, which is still quite a big military area. And there were probably 6 of us in my little group of officers, if you like, in the camp. And because we were near Salisbury, we were staying in a hotel in Salisbury, and we went out, each night as a group. And of course, a bunch of young men in their sort of late 20s or whatever, getting quite leery. And we were in a Chinese restaurant in Salisbury, and there were a bunch of girls having a sort of hen do at a party at a table nearby. And some of our lads got a bit drunk, I suppose, and were being a bit cheeky and, chatting them up and so on. And somebody complained to the management. And the management, because of the way we were, not because of the way we were dressed, but we all had, military haircuts and things. So they thought we were actually a bunch of soldiers off duty from the Salisbury barracks. And in fact, they chased us down the street. It was really quite extraordinary. We were sort of about to leave, and there was a fair bit of barracking and sort of, argy-bargy going on. No physical violence at that point. But they summoned some other sort of friends from another restaurant down the way, and arrived, into the restaurant as we were sort of leaving and trying to get out. And I can't remember now, but it was sort of, you soldiers, you're all the same when you're off duty, It was, and they thought we were just, drunken, misbehaving sailors, and literally did chase us down the street. It was quite odd. But I was going to get beaten up for being a soldier when all I was, of course, was just a thespian that looked like a soldier.
So you zigzagged backwards and forwards to Australia. When was the decision made for you to settle in Sydney? What made you fall in love with Sydney?
That's, as I say, the affair that I was having with this guy Stephen went on and off, as I say, for about 11 or 12 years. So lasted quite a long time. He came to London. He studied for a while at the Royal Institute of Art, in Royal College of Art in London, and blah, blah. And then I came here and I'd stayed, as a tourist for a while and back and forth and that kind of stuff.
So he stayed in Sydney?
Well, he either in Perth or in Sydney or in Canberra. So he came to London periodically for one, maybe for a year once, and then for 18 months another time, and so on. So, it was a long distance sort of affair that carried on, but it ran out of steam, after 15 years, something like that. which was fine. Well, it ties in a way with I was a very bad drinker in those days, and
Yes.
it sort of tied in with when I finally got my drinking under control, well, stopped drinking basically. I changed a bit as a person, and our relationship changed therefore, and it sort of came to, as far as I was concerned, it came to a natural end. And it was a bit messy, but we're the best of friends now. I actually went and visited him and his current partner, who they live south of Canberra now. I went and visited them just a couple of weeks ago.
Hmm.
So after all this time, we're still good friends, which is lovely.
So
Um,
talking about
yes.
drinking, I've had some history of looking after a friend of mine who had some issues with alcohol, and it always fascinates me as well. Um, when did you realise that you had to change? Because it's a big decision to come to, and I'm really proud of your results. You've been sober for how long?
If I manage it, I will have been sober for 27 years in about a fortnight. My anniversary, as I call it, is the 21st of April. So yeah.
It's absolutely amazing to hear that, first of all. But what was the crux? What made you decide?
Um, I think I was in my mid 40s then, and my life didn't really seem to be going anywhere. It had become very narrow and dark and depressive, and I thought I suffered from depression, which I don't.
Hmm.
I know there are some people that do, and respect to them, but I don't really suffer. I'm the opposite. I'm quite a glass half full person, not a glass half empty when in my natural state. But alcohol is an addictive drug, and I was able to fool myself for years that I didn't really have a problem with it because I didn't drink every day. I just, I'm what they call a binge drinker,
Hmm.
so that I could go weeks, sometimes even months, without really drinking, and then I'd have a really bad time and have several days of drinking and blackouts and all sorts of things. And I got, I lost my license. They call it a DUI here, I think.
Yeah.
They call it that in Britain, but I lost my driving license twice for being caught driving, and I of those couple of times, there were many, 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 many times I drove drunk, and I thank goodness that that I never injured myself or anybody in the car, or God forbid somebody outside the car when I was doing something which now I find almost inconceivable. But at the time, you just behave in a slightly insane way, I think. Um, and it coloured my life. As I say, I was getting into middle age. I thought that my life was unfulfilled. I wasn't in a relationship anymore. I didn't seem to have success in work things. I wasn't happy with where I lived, all those sort of things. And I thought that that was why I drank. Whereas, of course, the opposite was true. It was the fact that I was drinking and the way that it affects your mental state that was the cause of it. And then one day, almost by accident, I found myself at the end of my tether, and I called a helpline. Um, not not Alcoholics Anonymous or anything like it. It never occurred to me that I was an alcoholic because I didn't understand anything about alcoholism. I thought that I was just a middle-aged poor old thing whose life wasn't very happy, and that's why I drank. Um, so I rang a helpline, and they gave me an address to go to, and to my astonishment, it turned out to be an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting. Um, and that first day, um, I found I didn't really want to go in, but while I was mulling it over in my head, my feet kept moving, if you like. And I found myself in this very strange church hall off the back of Oxford Street in central London. And people were sharing, as the AA term goes, people were talking about it and talking about stuff that I realized had been going on in my head since I was a teenager, about having a sort of slightly skewed view of the world and my place in it and all sorts of stuff um, that's hard to describe, but which, people who acknowledge themselves as alcoholic understand totally. I mean, I've been searching for something, can I say spiritual? Because I'm not at all a religious person, but I've been searching for some kind of spiritual connection since I was a teenager. And I found something of that in AA, that first day that I went. And even more astonishingly, I didn't pick up a drink that night, and I haven't picked up an alcoholic drink since that day, all those years ago, which is, considering I'm about the same length of time sober now as I was drinking. If you think that I was abusing drink in my late teens and got in when I was 45, that'd be about 26, 27 years. And I'm nearly 27 years sober now. So it's almost like half my life on each side. And
Wow.
I know which one I prefer because, my life these days is an extraordinary adventure as opposed to a rather despairing dead end.
It's absolutely incredible, and your dedication to AA still lasts today. I know that, and I know that you found you'll support people, and yeah, it's such a wonderful story to hear. That
Yeah,
people, it's always such a big step to call a helpline to start,
yeah,
but I know with depression or with addiction, it's such an important step to take, but it's something that you have to make in your head to
yeah.
take that step.
Yeah, AA is full of cliches and stuff. Most of them are cliches because they're truisms. And one of the ones that I identify with is that it is a solution for people who want it, not for people who need it. There are many, many, many people who need it,
Mm.
but you've got to actually want it in order for it to work. Because unless you hit that classic phrase, unless you hit your rock bottom and are desperate enough to pick up that phone, as you just said, then nothing really happens. And I've watched many people, over the years come in, get better. It's amazing how resilient the human brain and the human body is. You can bounce back, if you like, really quite quickly. In 2 or 3 weeks, people with a severe drink problem, can feel so much better really quickly. But the trouble is, you can feel so much better to the degree that you want to celebrate that.
Mm.
And of course, sadly, a lot of people celebrate that by having a drink. And
Have
then
you,
just,
in the early days, I know that if you come and stay here, for example, Amanda will forget and offer you a glass of wine, and it's not a problem. You always say, no, 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 that's fine. But in the early days, was that difficult to knock back or to stop?
it wasn't really because I sort of, I wasn't like in my early 20s or whatever. I had many years of abusing it, and it was such a relief to realize that there was an answer. As I said at that first meeting, I felt there's something here that's an answer to that. So it wasn't really difficult. And I'm not a particularly social person anyway. So my life hadn't been a round of pubs and clubs and bars and stuff and dance halls with fellow alcoholics or whatever.
Mm.
So I wasn't a regular attend. Well, that's not entirely true. I did go to my local bar. My posh apartment building that I lived in had a bar in the building, so it wasn't very far to sort of stagger home, or indeed be escorted home by the sort of night staff on more than one occasion. But there was a bunch of people that I drank with there, and when I stopped drinking, I just never saw them again because that was the only place I ever had seen them. If I ever saw them around the building, we just sort of nod and pass by, and that was it. So I didn't really find it, hard. And I didn't really have dinner parties where people drank that sort of thing. So it wasn't for me. I mean, it was almost a charmed life, really. But I have had I always think, quite a sort of lucky and charmed life. So in my drinking days, I wouldn't have thought that. But now, in retrospect, I realise that I'm not a religious person at all. So I don't really, I don't think of in terms of like a divine intervention or whatever. But I do think that I've probably got some kind of guardian angel or guiding spirit in or around me that's allowed me to do some really lovely things over the years. And one of those is, getting sober and turning my life into quite an adventure. Anyway, the question you asked me is, how did I end up here?
Yeah, that's right. Let's go back there.
I, uh, the time goes, as you know, as you get older, the years seem to go by faster and faster. And I didn't, even in sobriety, I didn't start any more relationships, really. I didn't have another major relationship. I haven't had one for a long time. But as I say, I'm quite a lone sort of character anyway, so I'm not unhappy with that at all. Um, but I carried on. I sort of drifted out of my chosen career, my acting career, um, because I got to the point where I was a bit. This is after I'd been to Australia and gone home. Yeah, um, I never really seemed to pick up a sort of a dynamic of getting plenty of work or whatever. Like many actors
Mm.
don't manage to do it, and so I never managed to really make enough money to live on. And by the time you get into your sort of mid late 30s or whatever, you start doing other stuff, or I did, and I ended up working with a friend who had quite a successful event and exhibition business, and I became what you might call a producer, really, of those kind of shows. I was the one who um, built the show or supervised the building of an exhibition or event and ran our office when it was open and then took the show down again. If you think in terms of, exhibitions in, conference or exhibition centres, that kind of stuff. Most trade shows rather than public stuff, but conventions and whatever. Anyway, I drifted into that for a long time, probably for 20 years or more, because for the first time in my life, I could actually afford to pay the bills and my rent without worrying about that. As time went on, circumstances changed, and I ended up. I moved out of London. I became a bit sort of fed up with living in London, and I moved out by the seaside for a change. And I found myself working in a little country house hotel, being the night manager. But I was also still doing a little bit of work in the exhibition business with an older mentor of mine, if you like, who should have retired, but he didn't really want to. So I used to do a bit of work for him just to keep his little business ticking over from his home.
So whereabouts was that?
That was in the west of London, in a place called Kew, on the way from London out to Heathrow Airport.
Okay.
And I'd started working with him and my old friend in the exhibition business on a different project, maybe 10 years earlier. But paths had diverged. The exhibition business well, anywhere, can be quite entrepreneurial when you have these small companies around, because the idea is that you start a new exhibition, you grow it a bit, and then a bigger organization will buy it from you, and you make money, and they take the show away, and they make money, and everybody's happy. And that's sort of how we've been for a few years. But as I say, my older mentor, was virtually at retirement age and was just running a little office from his home, and I used to go there, just eventually one day a week, just to pay his bills and keep things ticking over. So I'd become a sort of office manager, PA, all rolled into one, and we didn't really do any event business anyway. Then we had a little bit of a falling out. I won't bore you with the story because I'm not sure that I quite understand how it happened anyway, but we did have a falling out. And I said, look, it seems to me we've come to the end of a road here. You don't really need me. You haven't needed me for years, and I don't feel, welcome here. So I'm going to go. So I did. And I went back down to my little place down by the sea. And I thought to myself, what am I doing with my life? I was getting on for 60. I thought, what am I doing with my life? I'm here, I'm doing, 3 nights running this little hotel. I'm now not working with Richard. I've moved out of London because I'm sort of over London. I'm looking for something else. And this little voice said to me, go back to Australia. Now, just to qualify that, whilst I hadn't, been in a relationship with Stephen for for the previous, God knows how many years,
Mm-hmm.
I kept in touch. But I also had a very close friendship with a lady who I had been at drama school with many years earlier, an Australian lady,
Brenda.
who when I'd gone out to visit, I'd gone out to visit her, and sometimes Stephen, but sometimes just Brenda, because we were sort of, well, I felt we were sort of soulmates. We were more or less the same age. Our birthdays are in the same month.
Mm-hmm.
And, and we get on, have always got on really well. So I've gone and visited her, and suddenly this idea came into my head, go to Australia. So I sent her, I think it was probably an email. I'm pretty sure it was an email now I think about it. I sent her an email saying, listen, I'm coming out again soon, if that's all right, but I'm only buying a single ticket. And she said, oh, okay then. So that's exactly what I did. I came out in whatever March of that year. Given that I'd sort of finished the stuff with my exhibition friend in January, so by March, I, if you like, wound up my affairs in Britain, gave up the rental of the house I was living in, sold off all my bits, put a lot of stuff into storage, and took a flight out. Um, and came and well, stayed with some friends in in Western Australia, funny enough, briefly, not Stephen, but some other friends, mutual friends,
Mm-hmm.
and then came across to Sydney. And, and we just picked up, as old friends do, picked up my, sort of friendship with Brenda, after I think I'd been here. I hadn't been out for about 8 years before that. I think I'd been out, I was out for the centenary 2000
Mm-hmm.
Olympic Games, and then I'd come out a couple of years after that, like maybe 2002. So there'd been quite a big gap in between that, and then so it was 2011 when I came back again.
Okay.
Um, Sort of moved in with Brenda, and we were in Gladesville at the time in Sydney, and we just picked up our friendship. I hung around and did stuff, became sort of did the garden, and did the sort of did the sort of man things around the building. And all it all worked very well. As it turned out, Brenda was looking to move, which she did, and I organised, if you like, most of the moving stuff. The packing of stuff and the van and all that kind of stuff. And we moved up to the Central Coast. But the time flew by, and it got to, I suppose, around October of that year. And we've often chatted, because our birthdays are within a week, we've often had a sort of annual, even when I was in England and Brenda was in Australia, we've had a lot of chatting about, how's life going? What are we doing? Sort of appraisal of how your life is. And we got to that period, and I was allowed to come and go for a year because I had a sort of multiple visitor visa.
Mm-hmm.
But it came to that sort of end of that 6 months or whatever, and we said, this is sort of working okay, isn't it? And I said, yes, but if it's going to carry on, I'm going to have to think in terms of whether I can stay here or not. So I went to New Zealand so I could extend my visa, because each time I came in, I got another 6 months, if you like.
Mm-hmm.
And I did that a couple of times. And we moved in the meantime up to the Central Coast, and talked about it, and I started a process of getting residency or whatever. That process took a couple of years just to get the sort of permanent residency, and then another couple of years after that, and eventually I got citizenship on the basis that Brenda and I were sort of long-term companions, and we're going to drift into sort of gentle elderly, whatever, as sort of mutual companions and support. We've never been in a relationship beyond that. But, I was quite happy with that, at my sort of age. I was quite happy to sort of settle in that kind of way. But not long after that, maybe a year after that, things sort of changed, and I realised that, maybe this wasn't how Brenda saw the future. And indeed it wasn't. So I struck out on my own and ended up where I now live in
the heart of Sydney. And you were working with Sydney City Council, doing a job which I think is perfect for you.
Yes, I mean, initially I wasn't allowed to work, and then I took a job as a concierge in residential buildings rather than hotels, which was a bit like what I'd been doing in Britain before I left. But yes, out of that, while I was working there, the opportunity, because I've always loved, Australia and Sydney and the history of the place, the history of the colony and that sort of stuff. I surprised myself with how much I know. And I was able to apply for and got a job as a visitor services officer, very grand sounding title, with the City of Sydney. So I was based in the town hall or a customs house down at the pointy end at Circular Quay. The job of that department is to engage with visitors to the city and help them to have a good visit and a good holiday, and hopefully, suggest things that maybe they wouldn't have thought to do, or that they wouldn't know to do, because, it wouldn't be in the sort of standard guidebooks and things. And that was great. Yeah, I mean, because I've traveled quite a lot in different places myself. And as I say, because of my interest in sort of history and local stuff here, it was a very, very lovely, very rewarding job.
Absolutely. And I remember you saying how busy it was whenever the boats came in.
Yes, indeed. And then, of course, the boats didn't come in 2.5 years ago or whatever. Actually, is it 2.5? Yeah,
It feels like 10, but yeah, whatever.
Yeah, but yeah, 2 years ago, the boats stopped coming. So, of course, the visitors stopped coming by boat or by plane because of COVID, as we know. So the job stopped.
So I know that you're a very creative person. I first met you in 2018, where you will forever be the Sherlock Holmes to my Dr. John Watson. When we did the Baskerville, the Sherlock Holmes play at Wowo Little Theatre, which was amazing for me. It was my first kind of stepping back onto the stage after many, many years. And I think the day that we first met, we clicked and we became firm friends. And it was an amazing play. It was a fast farce. So it was such a fast play to be part of. But yeah, I had an absolute pleasure doing it. But I know that you being a creative, and we've been to see each other's plays since then, and then all of a sudden in 2020, the world died.
Yeah.
How did you as a creative handle COVID, the isolation, the not being able to go anywhere?
Well, I mean, partly because, as I've said earlier, as I touched on earlier, I'm quite a lone bird anyway, so I'm comfortable living on my own here. And through the pandemic, it didn't really make a great deal of difference in a way. I still was able to go out on my bike or walking. And around the area, and obviously I kept away from anybody else. But in that kind of term, I was able to, to maintain a certain amount of health and get some fresh air and so on. So there wasn't really an issue with that. The creative stuff was slightly more difficult, but just because of, I suppose, the bunch of people that I knew and so on, both here and in Britain, and I've got some old friends in the theatre that live in New York and in England and so on. And a lot of people quite quickly started doing online things like play readings of Shakespeare, and Shakespeare is one of my faves, as you know. So I was able, because of this wonderful thing called Zoom that came out almost immediately, it seemed to me anyway, almost overnight. We had this Zoom thing that's got more and more finessed as time's gone on. But yeah, I remember going through, doing loads of those kind of experiences. I mean, there was no actual work happening because everything was shut, as you say. But people found, I mean, I never did any of the organization of these things, but I was more than happy to tune into, people doing play readings in New York or in London or here in Sydney. And that sort of fulfilled a certain amount of creative stuff. And then out of that, it suddenly dawned on me that, I maybe didn't need to keep looking for work, as in terms of jobs beyond acting. I mean, we haven't talked about acting much since I came here in 2011. But it occurred to me that, maybe I didn't need to keep looking at websites, and in between lockdowns and sort of opens and close and so on, I ended up doing some work for the electoral committee, doing sort of working on the census during the lockdown period, in between different lockdowns. So I ended up working for the Australian Electoral Committee and the Bureau of Statistics in that kind of thing. So I've been doing those kind of things, thinking I've got to keep earning money, but it almost as if I suddenly realised that was a habit that I'd had, most of my working life, and that maybe I could work a different way.
Mm-hmm.
And I was really fortunate that because I was working for the City of Sydney, I was able to get the apartment that I live in now, which is, run by a housing trust, if you like. So it's affordable housing. And I realised that if I got an occasional paid acting job, and I also now get pretty small but reasonable pension from England, because I've been a taxpayer in England all my life, that I could actually survive, albeit modestly. But because I don't socialize that much. I don't go out eating out or drinking or whatever. My only expense other than living expenses is I do like to travel, and that's been curtailed anyway because of the pandemic. So I decided that maybe I didn't need to keep looking for work, and I thought, what, I might do something creative. I always had a bee in my bonnet about writing stuff, and I tried over the years. I've often written bad poetry, and I tried over the years to write a little play or something like that, but I've always got to the end of act one or scene two or whatever and sort of run out of steam. And I thought, well, maybe I need to not be quite so arrogant and get some training. So after a gap of 40 years or so from when I finished drama school, I enrolled myself via the Open University with Macquarie University and started studying towards a BA in English and creative writing.
Wonderful.
Which was just extraordinary. So I started studying this, and within weeks, I learned some really interesting stuff about, creative writing and how you could approach it in a different way, which wasn't about having an idea and trying to write about it, but basically it was about sitting, as I've often read about writers saying it, about sitting and looking at a piece of paper, or in this case, looking at a screen, until something sort of pops into your head, and then start writing about that, and not think about where it's going or what it's going or what's going to happen, and just let it come, almost like like a sort of stream of consciousness thing, I suppose. And that was a major eye-opener to me, because I suddenly found myself writing stuff I wasn't expecting to write, or about things I wasn't expecting to write, and it was a really lovely learning curve.
It's a fascinating process, isn't it? When you're in the zone, when something comes and you start to get on a roll with it, how it just comes out. I've only written a couple of short films actually, but each time I've done that, once you're in the zone and you've got it, it just kind of comes out in the first night.
Well, the characters, sort of almost appear and write themselves, which is quite extraordinary. People start, people you hadn't even expected to be in the story suddenly appear as part of it. It's quite liberating and exciting, but in a way quite hard to do, because it doesn't come naturally yet. So I don't entirely trust it, if you like, or I'm working on trusting it.
So when you came back to Australia, there were various roles in theatre. I know you've done some television commercials. You've done some comparing where you're hosting things. But one role in particular, which I love you to talk about, is your role with Convict Footprints, which not only was scripted, but there was a lot of ad-libbing that you had to do with that role.
Very much so, yeah. We had moved from the city up to the Central Coast, and there was a little article in the local paper about Convict Footprints, who were setting up a joint venture with Gosford Council, and they were going to do what you might call reenactment theatre about early parts of the colony, and they were looking for convicts and people like that. And Brenda said to me, "Oh, look at this, acting, blah, blah, blah." And I said, "Well, yes, but, convicts didn't live to be, 60 plus, so what's the point of that, Well, she said there must have been other people, around. And I thought, there must have been. There were governors and administrators and things. So I wrote a slightly cheeky letter to this organisation saying exactly that, I see you're looking for convicts, but, surely there are older people, Governor Darling in 18 thingy was 59 or whatever. And I obviously struck a chord because they asked me in for an audition, and I went to Gosford Town Hall, if there is such a thing, or something like that. And a representative of the council was there, and two guys from Convict Footprints, and we talked and about history and blah blah blah. And then one of them said, "Can you do a Scottish accent?" So I said, my father was a Scot, and I instantly started reading them something from a Shakespeare book that they had there in my father's rather gruff Scottish, sort of rather bad-tempered voice, which is the way that I remembered him very clearly. And they sort of smiled and said, "Oh, yes, that's really interesting." Anyway, long story short, Thomas Mitchell, later to be Sir Thomas Mitchell, but at the time not, Major Thomas Mitchell, was the Surveyor General of the colony in the late 20s, 1820s. And he was an irascible Scot who his reputation for wanting everything to be straight lines and above board and whatever was, he's well known for that. But he was a very good engineer, cartographer, and road builder. And he was employed by the colony of New South Wales to help to build or to supervise the building of major roads for the first time from Sydney to Newcastle, for instance, the thing that's called the Great North Road, plus the Great Western Highway through to the mountains, and the Great Southern Highway down to Goulburn and places like that. And that was his job. And Convict Footprints decided they would tell some of that story on a part of the Great North Road that still exists from Wiseman's Ferry going up into the hills beyond in the national park there. And because of the fact that it was almost immediately redundant, because they started using steamers to get up the coast from Sydney to Newcastle in the 1820s, it became obsolete pretty quickly and was sort of just left, really. But it was so well built, good old Mitchell and his chain gangs of convicts, that to this day it's still in pretty good shape. Has some wonderful masonry, some fabulous sort of stone buttresses holding up the side of the road as it winds its way up the mountain. And Convict Footprints wanted to tell some of that story. So basically, people would pay, to be part of that audience, but they would be treated as visitors inspecting the site of the building. And they'd be sent up from the gate at the bottom of the road. And when they came round the corner, they'd be transported back in time because they would be met by Major Mitchell and his soldiers' escort and thanked for coming to visit and inspect this newly built road, and follow us up and we'll explain it to you. And they would get a history lesson in the building of the road, how the drains were built and all that kind of stuff. They'd meet convicts working on the road. These are other actors, obviously. They'd meet one convict trying to escape who was chiseling his name into the side of the road and got caught, and so on, up until we got to a place at the top which had been a sort of rest spot for the convicts back in the old days. And there they would get some tea and some damper bread and then be left with a bunch of the convicts who would then tell some of their story. And to me, it was historically fascinating because the guy who wrote it, a very talented actor, producer, director, called Stephen Hockley, had used verbatim reports and letters and so on from the time, so that people who told their story were more or less telling it in their own words.
And you were there on the site where it happened.
We were on the site of where some of this stuff had actually taken place. Oh, actually, the guy, just a bit of theatrical stuff, the guy who had been trying to escape, who'd been caught down the road, was of course escorted up with us and was given a pretty convincing flogging before the convicts told their story. And that was an interesting bit of technical stuff, because we had to, I mean, I had nothing to do with it really, but we had to work out sort of a convincing lashing that looked like it was, drawing blood and all that kind of stuff. And it was a theatrical experience for the audience. And then the convicts told their story, and then that would finish, and we'd escort them, if you like, back down the road, thank them for coming, and hand them back to the parks department at the gate down at the bottom, and that would be the end of it. But that ran on and off for about 4 seasons. We do it twice a year for a couple of weekends, 2 or 3 weekends, and then out of that, the Convict Footprints started to move to other places. So that we did one production out at Castle Hill, which was about the Irish Rebellion that took place a few years later. And I did a couple of other things with them. And then, Convict Footprints is not running at the moment, really. But they did other stuff at Manly, at the quarantine station, and at Cockatoo Island, so on. So it's obviously gone into abeyance during the close down, but it might well operate again. But yeah, I really enjoyed it because, the role was, I was channeling my father, which was good for me, was sort of quite an interesting experience. But I was also, doing some educational, historical stuff, which was true. And as you say, there was lots of opportunity for not so much interaction with the audience, although sometimes we did get those kind of things. When we did school groups, sometimes that was quite fascinating because, of course, most of the kids would have things. They'd have their phones with them, and they'd be looking up references that I was making, say, and then showing them to me. And I'm, of course, having to express astonishment as how they managed to get moving pictures on these tiny frames. You have to because you have to always, keep in character.
Absolutely. Oh, it'd be a wonderful, wonderful opportunity for any actor to be able to do something like that, and to prove your chops, including your mutton chops, which you had to put on. You had the most amazing sideburns in that. I'll have to put a picture up on the Facebook page for people to see. But
they got better and better. They were pretty ropey in the beginning, but I went and got some, proper ones. There's a very good wig and facial hair shop just off Oxford Street in Sydney. And I had a couple of sets of mutton chop whiskers from them, which I used, over and over again. I would take them home and religiously sort of clean them and get them ready for the next time, and then stick them on again. And every time I did it, I got a bit better at applying them, so they looked more and more convincing. In the beginning, there were one or two. Talking of school parties, I remember in the early days, my first set of whiskers, which were not really very good because they were. I don't think they were homemade, but I bought them online and they weren't that good. And I was conscious one time I was walking down the road after we'd done the whole thing with a party of school kids, and I almost felt like an insect was fluttering against my cheek.
Oh no!
I realised that it was one of my whiskers was coming unstuck, so I had to spend the rest of the time holding it on there. And I was quite frightened that one of the, how observant children can be.
Absolutely.
One of the kids was going to, come straight up to me and say, "They're not real whiskers," But, mercifully, that moment passed. My favourite moment for silly stories was we had stopped at one point to look at some of the construction of the stonework or whatever, and suddenly there was a bell rang in the distance and a voice that sort of said, "Look out, coming through," and it was two guys on mountain bikes. Which you were allowed to have mountain bikes on the Great North Road, but you were supposed to walk them down.
Mm-hmm.
But anybody, myself included, who is a bike rider, would never give up the opportunity of barreling down the hill, from wherever they had come from. So they were hurtling down this hill, and the crowd, if you like, which was probably 20 people or so, and myself, we sort of parted and allowed them through the middle, and they came through really quite speedily. They didn't say anything, but they shot through. And there was this sort of silence. And I could see people in the audience sort of looking at me, at Thomas Mitchell, to think, well, how's he going to react to that? Because they were used to me chatting, to them.
Mm-hmm.
And I looked sort of as if I was slightly startled and bemused, and said to the military sergeant who was the escort at the time, captain, I think he was actually, and I said, "That's very strange, Captain." I said, "But I don't know about you, but I think I've just had an H.G. Wells experience." Like a sort of, an event that had happened from the past and come through or something. and people laughed and we just carried on, But it was, I remember that with great, I don't know where that came from. Do you know what I mean? That wasn't scripted. I was expecting to say it. But you end up, you've done this too, I'm sure, you end up in character, and you can, if you're sufficiently if you know your character sufficiently well, you can react to anything in a sort of appropriate way,
Absolutely. And we've got a lot of amazing characters over the years in Australian theatre and television, like your Dame Ednas and your Norman Gunstons, who the character just becomes its own character, its own personality.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, Mr. Charles, can I talk to you about your latest health issue, which I know tomorrow you're going into hospital. Can you tell me how you found out about the issue that you have at the moment?
Yeah, yes, I can. Strange but true. Last year, I suppose about June or July of last year,
Hmm.
I became conscious of the fact that I seemed to be getting more headaches than I would normally get. When I was young, I used to suffer from migraines, but that stopped probably in my 30s or 40s, so a long time ago. But I knew what migraines were like, and I started getting this rather specific pain in my head, sort of on the crown of my head, so quite high up, always in the same place. Um, and it took a little while, like if something's going strange with your body, it takes a little while for it to become a conscious feeling. So I thought, that's odd, I'm going to monitor this. So I suppose throughout July and August of last year, I kept a note in my diary or whatever of when these headaches arose. And as I say, they were always in the same place, they were always about the same kind of intensity, and they weren't a migraine because it didn't have the other symptoms that migraines have. It just was this pain in my head, and it would keep me awake sometimes at night, or it would happen during the day. And so I kept monitoring. And after a couple of months, it seemed to me as though it was happening every 4 or 5 days,
Hmm.
which seemed strange. So I think I had mentioned it right back at the beginning of the year once to my doctor, because when I was having an online chat with him, because we weren't going in at that point, so it was all like telecommunication. Um, when I mentioned it to him and said I had been monitoring it, he said, "Oh yes, you mentioned that back in February," and he'd obviously made a note which I'd forgotten. And I said, it seems, odd. And he said, well, yes, he said, let's get a scan just to be on the safe side. So that's exactly what we did. And to his surprise and mine, it revealed that I actually had 4 aneurysms in my head, in my brain, or close, located in the masses of arteries and things that go around your brain and head. But the first thing that one should say, as he said to me, and as the neurosurgeon said to me, is that the headache that I was getting at the top is not in any way connected to the aneurysms, because aneurysms, as some of the listeners may know, do not have symptoms. They just are. And most people only find out they have an aneurysm if it bursts, because then you can get bleeding on the brain. And depending on how big and severe the aneurysm is, it can be very much life-threatening.
So what was the feeling you were feeling in the top of your head? What was that coming
Well,
from?
again, we don't know. There are many, if you look online, you Dr. Google, it'll tell you there are many headaches that arise and people don't really know what they are or whatever. But there are a lot of tension headaches around. And my conclusion is we have to come back to where we are now. And the fact that because I'm having surgery, I had to stop studying this semester. So I stopped studying at the end of February, because I was originally going to have my operation in early March, but it's been postponed till tomorrow. And as a result of that, I'm not spending maybe 4 hours a day in front of my computer screen, reading and studying and doing things like that. And I realize that I haven't had any headaches.
Ah, okay. So it's absolutely amazing that you were able to discover something that is potentially life-threatening that you're able to solve now.
Yes, that particular headache, I think is just a tension headache caused by my arms and shoulders being at the wrong angle when I'm sitting working, and because I'm not doing that, because I've stopped studying and stuff, those headaches have stopped. But obviously, in the meantime, the aneurysms which were spotted need to be dealt with, because if they do rupture, then obviously I'm in trouble.
So what are your feelings today going into the operation tomorrow? What's going to be involved in the actual operation?
Okay. So having discovered on the initial scan that I had these aneurysms, I then went to a neurosurgeon who sent me for another scan where they shoot colored stuff up into your brain to absolutely identify where they are. And then, and he said to me, well, they have to be operated on. There are 3 smallish ones and 1 quite large one, which is sort of above and behind my left eye. My feelings, I don't know. I have to say, I said this to a friend earlier, and it's absolutely true. As the week has gone on, I've developed the same kind of feelings that I would have if I was rehearsing a play and opening tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
There's a certain amount of butterflies and not fear at all. There's a sort of nervous energy, excitement almost about what's going to happen because it's an experience I've never had before. But that's the nearest thing I can relate it to is how it feels when you've got an opening night happening. That it's, whatever's going to happen is going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And, who knows? But, as I touched on probably right back in the beginning when we were talking about drinking and so on, I mean, since I've stopped all that stuff and have a much more sort of positive and grown up, I see it anyway, as grown up attitude towards life, it's part of the adventure of life, and extraordinarily, as I think I said to you, considering I'm an actor, my neurosurgeon then rang me a week ago to say that they were apparently resurrecting a program that used to be made here some years ago called RPA TV.
Yes.
The hospital that I'm going to, the Royal Prince Alfred, and that they'd asked him if he had any interesting cases coming, and he said that yes, I was one of his interesting cases. So I've had a television crew here in my little apartment in Piermont, and I met with them yesterday when I went for a pre-operation scan, the latest scan, and had bloods taken, and then had a little interview with the neurosurgeon himself when we talked about tomorrow. And they'll be there tomorrow when I go in for pre-thingy, and they'll be filming the operation. So at some point in the future, I'll actually be able to see inside my own head, which is quite an exciting thing.
It's amazing because most of the time people go in hospital and they're asleep, they don't know what happens, but you're going to have the whole thing documented, which is fascinating. It's incredible that you're going to be able to have that on the other side.
Absolutely. And, for me, the most interesting thing is because I'm a professional actor, if you like, I'm comfortable in front of cameras and things like that. So we've been able to have quite fun, just wandering around talking about stuff like you and I are talking now, while they've been filming, and talking to me about stuff, for the program. So they've been very pleased. I'm not being, I hope, arrogant about it, but they've been very pleased to run in to somebody like me who's not fazed by, having cameras moving around while he's talking, because you and I both know that you spend a lot of time sitting around waiting while people adjust lights and stuff like that. And an average person wouldn't know that, would wonder what was happening, or indeed would be more nervous. I mean, when we saw the neurosurgeon yesterday, he was obviously far less used to having people say, "Oh, could you just do that again and say so and so with it?" Whereas I'm sort of chilled with that kind of stuff. So it's an interesting experience all round, really.
Absolutely. So you'll be in hospital for a few days?
Yeah, they think, the operation, I'll probably be first in tomorrow because they think the operation will be about 5 hours. And then I'm in intensive care tomorrow night, which is standard for when you have brain surgery. They'll do a scan on Friday, and if everything's okay, or appears to be okay, then they will remove whatever tubes and pipes I have in me at that point. And then it will be at least 3 days afterwards. So I'm sort of counting Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and probably Monday, Tuesday, because again, it depends on how quickly I respond and how they, I'm sure you know, when you're in hospital, they want to get you out as soon as possible, not just to free up the bed, but also because it's better for you to get to as soon as possible. So I'll be up and running as soon as they'll let me be up and running. But it will be, I would think, Monday or Tuesday before I'm actually out. And then I'm going to a friend's place who's got a spare room, and he's going to look after my welfare for a few days until I can look after myself and come home.
Well, my friend, we love you very much, and we're thinking of you tomorrow, and I look so forward to seeing you when you get out of hospital.
Yeah.
And getting you on this podcast again soon.
Okay. Yes, part 2. After.
Part 2. Yes, the aftermath. I hope they don't do what they all. Well, I know they will. Where you go into the operation and then you have to wait till after the next episode to find out whether you're okay. But at least this time I'll know you're fine, so I'll feel a lot better.
I suppose there'll be there. I mean, it's not the program's not going to just be about me. It's going to be a series of vignettes of different people. Whether it carries on beyond one episode, I know not. I have no idea. But yeah, we'll see. And then I'm sure certainly they talk about filming my recovery path, if you like, and they can't do that until I'm recovering. So it must presumably come in a later program. Meanwhile, James is back in his apartment in Piedmont, and here he is. And then there'll be a picture of me sitting in the corner drooling.
It will not be. Well, thank you very, very much for chatting today. You know how much you mean to me. And I'm very excited to have tomorrow already coming and going, and looking forward to the next chapter of our friendship.
Thanks, Clay. It's really nice to know you too.
Yarn About You is a Centre Stage creative production. Follow us on Facebook by searching Yarn About You, or visit yarnaboutyou.com.au for more information about the podcast and our guests.